Hi, it's Dave. Welcome. So today I'm joined by James Douma, and I've asked him to join because Neuralink, one of Elon Musk's company, last week presented a blog post and a video on YouTube showing a dramatic kind of show of a monkey playing mind pong with his mind using a Neuralink implant. I'm going to show you guys this video that Neuralink has up. So here's a monkey, and he's actually, controlling these Pong controllers on the screen. Initially, he was doing it by a joystick, but now he's doing it purely by his mind through a Neuralink implant that's wirelessly transmitting his brain signals to a computer, and he's able to play this game online. And so I wanted to bring James on and really kind of dissect this, ask him kind of his thoughts, but I wanted to bring this down to simple layman's terms, try to help the average person kind of understand what's going on here, what's the technology behind this, and how can we understand, where Neuralink is headed. So welcome, James.
Hey, great to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm curious, like on kind of the highest level, what is Neuralink doing here? How are they able to, translate this monkey's brain signals into, joystick movement so he can play a game like Pong?
So he's got two implants in his head, the monkey. When I say he has got two, I guess, do we know? Maybe it's a she. That didn't occur to me. So the monkey's got two implants, which are two of these link implants. That the implant itself is about the size of a watch, and it replaces a chunk of bone in the skull, and it has a bunch of probes on the bottom side of it. Inside the link is a set of electronics that let them either drive signals into the brain using the probes, read signals from the brain using the probes, and then sort of package them up and encapsulate them and then send them out of the skull via Bluetooth. The probes themselves are on the order of about 20 microns area. So they're small enough that they can be inserted into the brain tissue, and they can weave themselves between the neurons into the brain tissue. So they just basically put a grid of these inside a part of the brain where they know approximately what that part of the brain does. But the probes themselves are kind of random. Like they're going into a part of the brain that generally does the function that you want. But beyond that, they're just interfacing to a bunch of neurons that are there. So you put a bunch of probes in the brain, and for the case with this monkey, what they did was they put the probes into a part of the brain that is associated with the motor control for this monkey's right arm. And when the monkey is doing something, like when it's playing a joystick on a game, they can read the activity out of all those probes. So they're basically looking at thousands of points inside the neocortex of the monkey. And they're seeing these things sort of activate as the monkey does things. Now, when they put the probes in, they don't know what particular neurons, neurons have their own functions. Each one of them processes the outputs of other neurons. So there's kind of this functional hierarchy of things that they do, from the very low level directly connecting to, say, a muscle, or very directly connecting to a sensory neuron, to more abstract things, just like a computer neural network does, where as you work your way through these layers, you get more and more representative, more abstract things. Like famously, there's the grandmother neuron. When scientists were trying to figure out, what is the degree of knowledge encapsulation in the brain, there's some famous monkey studies that were done where they discovered that there was a neuron in a monkey's brain that would light up when it saw its grandmother, right? So that's the famous sort of grandmother neuron anecdote. But neurons can have these very high level, very concrete abstractions, but they can also have they can individually or in small groups, they can represent other kinds of things. So when they put these probes in the brain, they don't know which neurons they're connecting to or the functions of those neurons precisely. They know that region of the brain is generally associated with some particular high-level function. So what they need to do at that point, they've got a bunch of probes. They're kind of in the right area, but not necessarily connected to exactly the right neurons, but they have a bunch of them. So what they can do is they can observe the activity of the neurons that are in the proximity to these probes while the monkey engages in some activity. And then they can use signal processing and a machine learning algorithm at the computer side to figure out what's the translate, like how do you interpret the activity the brain of the monkey is doing and correlate it with what is happening? Because so while the monkey is moving the joystick around, he's trying to, the game itself has some objective that the monkey is trying to achieve, and he achieves that by moving the joystick around. At that point, the computer that's observing the monkey's brain is also observing the joystick. And what it does is it figures out what patterns of neuron activations correlate with what the monkey wants to do with the joystick, right? As he's moving the joystick around. Once you've got that figured out, you can flip it around. You can disconnect the joystick and the monkey can keep playing with the joystick. But now you're reading the signals in the brain and playing the game. And you can see in the video, the video's basically got 3 stages. They show the monkey playing where they're calibrating. They called it calibrating, but they're essentially recording from, they're having the link implant look at the brain activity, and then they have an external computer that correlates that activity with what the monkey's doing. They figure out what the transfer function is, like how do those those two relate to. Once you know that, which they say in the video that they were able to do within a couple minutes, which is quite amazing. And I think that might be the first time anybody has been able to like train that system in a few minutes. Once they know that pattern, you can disconnect the joystick, because as the monkey moves his arms around, you can see from the brain activity what he intends to do. And then the stage that goes beyond that is you take the joystick away, right? Then the monkey can just volitionally consider what he wants the cursor to do, and it will still do that. So in that video, you see 3 stages. You see them calibrating it, where the monkey's playing the game with the joystick, and the system externally is figuring out what the relationship is between the joystick movements and what the monkey's brain is doing. Mm-hmm. Then the second stage is you disconnect the joystick, but he's still moving his arm. So that's the direct translation. And then the third stage is you remove the need for the monkey to actually move his arm, and now he can play it without any of that stuff outside.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So let me share what my understanding is of kind of how this works, and if you can kind of shed some light here. So Neuralink has placed these transmitters. I think they're N1, they call it. And each transmitter is, I think it's like 1,024 or so probes or electrodes. And so they go into the motor cortex of the brain, which dictates how, I guess, a mammal or a person will move certain things. And what it's doing is let's say there's 1,000 probes in a motor cortex. It's gathering all of or each probe is gathering the firings of, or the sensitivity of the neurons that are being fired around those probes.
So when a neuron activates, you get a little pulse of electrical activity, because the axon of the neuron that takes the signal out of the neuron and transfers it to the dendrites of other neurons downstream, it has an electrical charge on its surface. And when the neuron fires, that electrical charge travels like a pulse down the length of the axon. That creates like a shift in the electrical field close to the neuron. And that's what these probes can detect. They can notice when a neuron fires, because they can detect that little pulse of electrical activity that's detectable outside the neuron when it fires.
Got it. So when the monkey is moving, let's say the joystick, what's going on is these 1,000 probes are tracking, kind of the electric signals around those probes to see how much the neurons around there are firing or not. And then, so they're able to basically translate, go, oh, okay, there's an up and down motion. And then there's also, I guess, a speed, a velocity of how fast maybe those up and down motions go, or they want to go, I guess. And so they're translating, all of that information of, I guess, a up signal, an up joystick movement would fire certain neurons around certain probes, and a down movement would fire other neurons right around the probe. And so
you could think of it that way.
And so they're basically taking that information of how the neurons are firing around the probes to translate that into movements, right, of the joystick. Is that kind of the gist of it?
Yeah, and you can try to get right down into the concrete example and say, well, there's a neuron in there somewhere that corresponds with joystick up. And they're trying to find it. They've got these 1,000 probes, and then they're trying to triangulate and figure out which one is that one neuron. Except, of course, that's not exactly how the brain works. But it's a fine idea to think about what's going on. The odds are that there probably is a neuron in the brain, or some small number of neurons, which are associated with that monkey wanting to move up. The odds that they manage to get a probe right next to that neuron are kind of low. But there's a pretty good chance that some of the neurons that feed that neuron, or some of the neurons that neuron feeds, are in the vicinity of the probes. So what that algorithm does that does the calibrating is it figures out what sets of activities that are seen at the probe just happen when the monkey wants to move up, and what other patterns happen when the monkey wants to move down or left or right, whatever. Essentially what they're doing is they're detecting volitional states that the monkey has, because they're motor states themselves. Like, you decide to do something, and then your brain actually moves your arm. So at some point you're deciding to do it, and somewhere down this chain of processing, there's another place where you actually move your arm. So in the beginning, what they do is they detect that actual movement of the arm thing, because that's the easiest thing to find. When the monkey's moving his arm because the joystick moves, and then you can correlate that. But at the end, what you really want to get to is you don't want the monkey to have to move his arm. So you want to sort of work your way backward up the volitional chain. So when the monkey just wants to move his arm, or when he thinks he wants the cursor to move, without having to signal it by moving his arm, he can tell the cursor to move directly. Mm-hmm. And so they start with the first calibration, and then they can work their way backward to the second one. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or alternately, sometimes it's the monkey that learns, right? This is one of the other magic things, right? Is that once the monkey gets the idea that he can move the cursor around, he can zero in, because he's got a feedback loop. He sees the cursor on the screen and he wants to move it, but he doesn't have a joystick now. And he kind of has a sense, because he's been playing with this thing, of what he needs to do in his brain, right, in order to make that thing happen. That's what learning is. So he learns that feedback loop, and then he trains his brain to interface to the neural network. Learning, one of the beautiful things about plugging a Neuralink into a brain is that you've got these two learning machines that are trying to talk to each other. The brain is a learning machine. And if you give it a feedback loop, it'll learn to talk to the Neuralink, right? It'll learn to translate the user's wishes into whatever signals it takes to get the Neuralink to do what it wants it to do. And on the other side, you have the Neuralink kind of doing the same thing. The calibration algorithm on the other side, it's also trying to figure out what they want to do and play the other half. Mm-hmm. In this experiment, this is happening kind of in two stages. In the first stage, they get the rough calibration, which is which neurons correlate with the monkey's arm moving, right? And the second half is probably the monkey learning, right? Oh, I don't have to move my arm. I can move the cursor even if I don't move the arm. And when you take the joystick away, you encourage him to learn that very quickly, or her.
Yeah. It's interesting. In this example with the monkey mind pong, is it just one way where the Neuralink is just reading the different things going on the probes? Because it doesn't seem like the Neuralink is putting anything back right into the monkey's brain.
They don't need to for this mm-hmm. experiment. So I'm guessing they probably don't.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
There are things you can do if you feed signals back into the brain also, that you can close that feedback loop in a different way. Like right now, the feedback loop is the monkey looking at the screen and seeing the cursor moving around and willing the cursor to move in particular ways, right? But you could imagine providing a different kind of feedback into the brain directly through the Neuralink, so the monkey could not even look at the screen and could still play Pong, because he would feel the game. He would feel the screen. He would feel the cursor. They would just know where it was. So he could focus on his banana smoothie and still play Pong.
Wow, that would be insane. I mean, are they pretty far?
They're not demoing that, so they're probably not doing it right now.
Is it pretty far off, you think? Something like that?
So putting signals into the brain is harder in some respects than taking them out. So there's a reason why these what Neuralink is doing is they're attacking the engineering problem of making this work. It's been possible for quite a while to put 1 or 2 probes or 50 probes or 100 probes in there crudely placed somewhere inside the brain and get some rough signals out. But one of the tricks to getting sophisticated functionality is getting lots of probes in there. If you get a lot of probes in there, you can bring very sophisticated signal processing to bear on the problem of figuring out from those thousands of probes exactly and with great confidence what the user wants. You don't have the thing where they're trying to do something and they can't quite do it, as if they have Parkinson's disease or they don't have motor control. If you have enough probes, you can really drill down. You can really narrow down on exactly what the animal is trying to do, or exactly what you want to put into the animal's brain, right? So having lots and lots of probes is really key. And in fact, they're at 1,000 now, and 1,000 is going to be fine for stuff like playing Pong. And you might be able to, use a keyboard with that sort of thing, but you're not going to be able to convey like sophisticated three-dimensional imagery. There's going to be a limit to the bandwidth that you can get out of it and how fast you can learn. Really, what you want is millions or billions of probes. You want really large numbers of probes. So they're starting with 1,000, and they're going to want to get to much, much larger numbers of probes down the road. Mm-hmm. And they're figuring out how to do that. Now, the brain itself it's not intended to plug into this, and so anything that you introduce into the brain has to accommodate the brain very, very well, because if it doesn't, the tissue of the brain will change and it will defeat you from being able to accomplish the thing you want. So it's a toxic chemical environment. It's the neurons themselves adapt. They will, the tissue will callous, right? It will, if it detects that there's an alien substance inside there, the immune system will attack it, or the brain will form a callus around it. Just being an aggressive chemical environment will tend to corrode a lot of things that you put in there. So they have a material science problem, like what kinds of materials can you put in there that will survive the brain and that also won't provoke the brain to try to defend itself from the link. And then on top of that, they've got so there's custom silicon that goes inside this thing, because they've got some very precise analog electronics for dealing with these very tiny signals that go in the brain. And they have to pull that out. They have to make it make sense. They have to compress it into a Bluetooth, stream, and then they have to send it out. And it has to run on really, really low power for two reasons. One is you can't put a big battery in there, and you want it to run, all day long or something on a charge. And the other thing is the brain is super intolerant of heat. So, all the energy that you use in this thing gets turned into heat, and, your brain will not like that. That will be bad. So it has to run super cool. It has to run for a long time on a very small amount of power. And they have to accomplish all of the sophisticated processing in a very, very small device that goes inside this. So they have a signal processing challenge. They have a packaging challenges. They have these material science challenges. And then there's some pretty fundamental neuroscience that they'll have to figure out as time goes on too. I mean, so far, most of the stuff that they've done is essentially scaling up existing techniques for stimulating the brain and existing techniques for reading back from the brain that were sort of more research. If you really want to commercialize this, if you really want to build an interface that would be consumer grade eventually and that you can use to help patients in the near term, you really need to nail a lot of these engineering challenges. And my sense of what Neuralink is doing right now is they're going down that path of figuring out how to solve these, like the stitching robot that they built. So these probes are incredibly tiny. They're way too small for a human being to insert manually. Even with Waldo's and a microscope, it would be really hard. But on top of that, not only do you want to be able to put them in the brain without tearing the brain tissue, which is very fragile, but you want to be able to insert them in a place where they're not going to impact the vasculature of the brain. You don't want to injure the brain. So on a very small scale, you want to be very particular about exactly where you put that. So you need a machine that's got the capability of looking at the brain tissue, figuring out the right spot, and then very carefully inserting the probe just to the depth that you want it to get to. So they built a robot to do this, which I think is exactly the right way to do it.
Interesting.
So They're tackling the problem of
Yeah.
building a robot. They're tackling the problem of doing figuring out the electronics. They're tackling the problem of the
Yeah.
material science, like what's the right shape for the probe, how many do we need, what's the right procedure for inserting them, and they're trying to demonstrate to themselves that these techniques, in a sense, the systems are so complicated. The brain is so complicated, and the immune system is so complicated that the only way to do this stuff, to learn about it, is to try it. You just got to build it. You got to
Yeah.
get in there, and you got to see what happens. So they're going to put them in and take them out and see how the brain responds, see how the link responds, and so on.
Yeah. I mean, it's, that material science point is interesting, how the brain will adapt and either callous or, and we don't know, if this monkey can still play Pong, who knows, a few months from now, maybe the brain will adapt. Right. I noticed, it's interesting that this whole Neuralink, experiment right here, there's a lot of factors or facets to it, like you're saying, but one of the facets seems to be the hardware, where you're able to shrink it down, Bluetooth device, low power with 1,000 probes, in the motor cortex. Like that seems to be pretty a huge endeavor for Neuralink to do. Plus you add like the ability to read all that information and to, decipher it into some type of, value. I'm curious your thoughts. Like you're mentioning how eventually maybe these probes will go into the hundreds of thousands or millions or who knows, billions of where we can read this stuff. What are some potential like future possibilities or applications? Let's say hypothetically you had a device that rather had 1,000 probes, has 1,000,000 probes. And let's say hypothetically we're just talking about reading it. Let's say not the input back. So just by reading, what can Neuralink do for, let's say, people in the future?
So you're somewhat restricted by where in the brain you place the probes, because the if you look at the neocortex, it tends to, you don't want the brain isn't organized where the connections between neurons just go everywhere. They tend to localize functions, which you want to do, so that a bunch of neurons that are working on the same thing, they tend to be co-located, which is why when you look at the surface of the brain, we can say, oh, this part's associated with moving your hand, and this part's associated with tasting on your tongue, and this part's associated with, itching your nose, and so on. There are all these little locales. So, for instance, if you wanted, the brain is very plastic, and it can learn to do things like, you could plug something into the motor cortex, which like moves your arm, and you could learn to see with it by injecting a vision signal into it. But it would take a really long time, because that's a very substantial reworking of the neural pathways that are already there. So typically what you want to do is you want to interface to the part of the brain which has signals that you're interested in. So the particular function that you're trying to do, at least if we're talking about an implant that a person gets as an adult and that they're a healthy adult, and we don't want the learning curve for using the implant to be 5 years long. We don't want them to have to do the equivalent of learning a foreign language or learning to play the piano really well. Then you need to start by going to where there's already activity which is closely related to the thing that you want to do. And that's why, these early experiments, we know what part of the brain, it's pretty easy to figure out what part of the brain is controlling the right arm. Like that's something that's been known for a long time. So they can plug right into that. But in principle, anything at the surface of your neocortex, if you just wanted to read a signal out, you could. So for instance, say non-volitional speaking, right? Or, you could go to the part of the brain which controls your vocal cords, right? And you could try to figure out what speech is. So without vocalizing, you could generate speech inside your head, and that could be communicated. If you used fingers, you could figure out a keyboard. And the motor cortex is a great place to go, because your body has a very substantial amount of neural capacity devoted to very, very fine control of the muscles in your body. So there's lots and lots of neurons that you can read there. And it's very plastic. Like humans learn new physical skills very quickly and very easily. So people could learn to use a brain implant that was plugged into that part for controlling things pretty easily. So that's a good place. Whereas, if I plug the Neuralink into your auditory cortex, which basically it's the part which is proximal to the nerve that comes from your ear into the brain. And it processes sound and converts that into acoustic perception. Well, obviously, if I try to use that part of the brain to, control a pong stick, the learning curve is going to be a lot longer. It's probably still possible, but on the other hand, if I plug into that part of the brain, I could do things like I could inject music directly into the brain, right? And not just, you could inject music that's imaginable, and you could also inject music that's not imaginable. If you go into a person's visual cortex, you could introduce a substitute for the vision that they actually have. But an interesting possibility is introducing substitutes for vision which humans cannot have. For instance, we can't see in infrared, or we only see 3 colors. But,
okay,
expand the spectrum, let people have 5 or 6 colors, right?
Okay, so let me try to see if I understand this the other way. So not just reading, but let's say putting stuff into the brain through a Neuralink. So hypothetically, let's say you had, a device that, had 1 million probes or something, and you wanted to implant a movie or something into the person's brain. And would it be something like how would that work? Would you have it where, for example, let's say a person watches a movie and you track all of the neurons, what they're doing while they're watching the movie. And then if you can do the reverse by somehow, sending through the probes the exact, signals where you can replicate the firing of the neurons that was happening when they were watching it, would that replicate the same visual experience?
Yeah, it would.
So that's basically putting into the brain.
So that's a way to do it. But it's a very interesting question. When you get into the brain, we have an interface to the world, which is our bodies and our senses and that kind of stuff. And so at the first level, the first thing that you can do is you can substitute any of those senses, vision, sound, taste, any of that stuff could be mimicked by essentially injecting the signals directly. And most of that stuff, there's a couple of exceptions, like your sense of smell. It's not actually accessible in your neocortex directly, right? It's deeper down inside the brain. And Neuralink has ambitions to eventually be able to go deep into the brain to place probes. But at least, for the near term, they're probably going to be looking at surface layers because they're just surgically much easier to get to. But almost all of the things that you volitionally want to do by moving your body, and almost all the things that you can sense by receiving senses directly in, those are all accessible. And the substitution process is kind of like what we saw with the monkey. It's pretty straightforward. You can calibrate the grid by looking at real stimulus and correlating to real stimulus to figure out what the conversion factors, and then you can very quickly learn to mimic whatever that stimulus is to put it into the brain, or vice versa, go the other way. Someone wants to imagine something, and you want to take that picture and put it straight into a computer. So they visualize something. There's, they create that, they construct that image in their visual cortex, and then the brain's like, oh, this is what they're thinking. Make a picture out of that, right? That can go. But you can go higher up the stack than that, right? Like when you watch a movie, right, there's this layer of pictures, right? And there's this layer of time-wise experience, but there's all this other stuff that happens, like, oh, this character's the good guy and that character's the bad guy, and there's a narrative arc and all this other stuff. And all of that is also accessible, right? So, you could skip the whole experience and go straight to the feeling of satisfaction you experience after you've seen a good movie without even watching the movie, right?
Got it.
Because all of that stuff that happens in your brain.
Theoretically, could you just give all of the different feelings that you would feel during that movie and end it with, the feeling at the end of the movie, just within a compressed period of time, You
could skip right to the end.
Exactly.
Wow, that was a great movie feeling without even knowing what the movie was necessarily. Yeah. Right? You can, but the point is anywhere along that phase is. So for instance, your brain takes these, pixels that it sees moving around on a television screen, and it turns it into something meaningful inside your brain, all different kinds of layers of meaning all the way up that stack. And a brain implant can potentially access that at any point up the stack, right? So, it could directly plug in the perception of the experience of watching the movie at a higher level than the visual sense. So, it's hard to explain exactly how this would go, but in a lot of ways, this is kind of what's happening when you dream, right? Like when you dream at night, you're not seeing those pictures, right? your brain is itself making that stuff up, and it's not making it up at the pixel level. Like you're actually dreaming at those higher levels where you feel like you're experiencing something, but you're not actually seeing those pictures. And
Yeah.
it's your visual cortex isn't necessarily constructing those images either.
I mean, would it be, I mean, a lot of it seems like it would be dependent on these probes accessing the right parts of the brain, right? Like having enough probes going close enough to the right neurons in order to fully kind of, access the right functions. I mean, is that kind of, I mean, would the Holy Grail be direct probes to neurons, all the neurons in the brain? Would that be like the ultimate,
right,
in a sense?
Yeah, ultimately what you want to do is you want to have a probe for every neuron, right?
Got it.
And you can plug directly into that. You don't, if you had a probe for 1% of the neurons, you could do almost everything you could do with a probe on every neuron. Like there, you get into diminishing returns as the numbers go up.
I mean, would that be because you're able to, the neighboring neurons are also tracking the firing or the electrical signal. So just putting 1%, you're getting, the gist of the overall network.
It's more along the lines of you can, imagine that, your brain has like 3 neurons in a row, right? And, something happens at neuron A and something happens at neuron B and something happens at neuron C, right? And then you read, what you want to know is what was happening at neuron A, but you happen to put the probe next to neuron C, right? The thing is, you've got this very powerful computer outside, which can look at this thing and it can figure out what A must have done in order to produce this signal at C, right? Because because if you've got a lot of probes in there, you can correlate the activity across a large number of probes, and you can infer what the other activity, the stuff that you can't see, what it must be in order to produce the action that you have. So the more computing power that you have off board, the more you can do with fewer probes.
Interesting. So the Matrix, like, they had this scene where was it Neo, downloaded a program or something to learn
Kung Fu,
Kung Fu, martial arts, right? Like just like boom, right? Or languages. Like theoretically, is that something that's possible, you think, with like a Neuralink? If, it was able to access, enough neurons or probes to, I mean, would the theory be like you would somehow track the process of someone learning, martial arts, picking up the motions, the behavior, all that stuff, and all of the, the neurons firing, et cetera, and then replicate that, but in a compressed period of time? Would that suffice? Or is there something, are there other limitations, you think?
The brain's not infinitely plastic. It has a time constant with respect to how fast neurons can rewire themselves. So there are aspects of that which are not realistic. Now, I don't know what Neo's got in his head besides, he's got some, I mean, he spent all that time inside the Matrix. There may be electronics in there in addition to the meatware that's there. But putting information into a brain, or that is teaching a brain a skill, is different from putting information into the brain, right? If you already have the hardware to perceive something, then being presented the image doesn't require rewiring the brain. It just requires stimulating the right set of neurons to create the perception. But to learn a skill actually requires the brain to rewire itself, because it's the shape of the wiring, it's the shape of the interconnect in the brain, which encapsulates those skills and knowledge and memories and whatnot. So if you want to stick memories into a brain, you need to stimulate the brain in such a way as to form the connections that correlate with those memories. And there's probably a speed limit to how fast you can do that. Mm-hmm. And the speed, we don't really know, but I'm guessing the speed limit doesn't let you learn Kung Fu in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a little bit of a stretch. But the flip side is, and this is how you get the Kung Fu instantaneously in the real world where you have Neuralink, right? It's the whole, could you become a Kung Fu master in 15 minutes with Neuralink? Well, yeah, actually you can. But the thing is, Neuralink doesn't put the information in your brain, right? What Neuralink does is you let the Neuralink take control of your limbs, and it does the Kung Fu for you, right? So you can get the Kung Fu software, the expansion pack for your martial arts, software download, and you download that puppy in there, and it takes Kung Fu and maps it onto, a model of your body, and it does the Kung Fu fighting for you, right? And, if that's unsatisfying, you can have you pay another 5 cents and you get the satisfaction module. So it makes you satisfied with what you experienced too, right? Getting into brain interface is really kind of interesting because, our kind of understanding of the nature of humanity, right, is bounded in our skin. And it's bounded by, kind of things that you can naturally get to and experience through what you experience and your brain rewiring itself in.
Yeah.
But having, really powerful direct brain computer interfaces, it kind of pulls the lid off of that, right? And all of a sudden, all kinds of, like the boundaries right now, human beings are separate. I'm in my skull and you're in your skull. And the way we communicate is, my skull figures out what it wants to say and moves my lips, to code that up and sends it to you and you decode it. But if we put a direct interface, a high bandwidth interface between our two brains, and then we live that way for a while so that our brains get used to communicating that way, eventually you get to a point where it's not really clear, there will be parts of my brain that are housing parts of your personality and parts of your brain that are housing my personality at some point, right? Mm-hmm. And so the divisions stop being really clear.
Yeah.
Really basic ideas of how we understand humanity start to be challenged at some point in this progression.
Yeah. Some of this stuff is kind of trippy to think about,
it like the possibilities, they're really, it makes, psychedelics, drugs and that kind of stuff, that's nothing. Right? Or Zen meditation, like whatever you could hope to achieve in terms of self-control through a lifetime of practice and attempting to master yourself is something that you might be able to jump right to the end of, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, not necessarily rewire the brain such that you have those skills, but achieve the same effect that you would have achieved through all that training.
This stuff is crazy, fascinating. I know we're wanting to wrap up, this talk right now, but I feel like there's a lot more to cover. One of the questions I want to ask you for a future episode is, how can Neuralink protect us, humanity, from, let's say, artificial general intelligence?
That's the raison d'etre for that, according to Elon.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So
the thing is, it's the if you can't beat them, join them strategy.
Yeah.
Right?
So, I want to actually dive into that, to give you and to dialogue on this, because I think this is a super important topic of the threat of artificial general intelligence. Does Neuralink help us in any way? Let's go ahead and save that for another kind of session where we'll give it, its full coverage.
It's going to be a long road. This is not something, they're kind of recapitulating a lot of the standard things that you want to do, but it's super exciting. And I wish the best. I'm super glad somebody did this. Somebody has needed to do this for a really long time because the potential's there. Like the basic technological capabilities and the basic understanding of the physiology of the brain have been there for a while to enable this. And now neural networks are actually giving us the other half of the pie. They're giving us the hyper flexible, super smart other part of the interface that makes it so that both sides of that brain computer interface can learn together and become something more than the sum of the parts. So it's super exciting, but there's safety is a big bear. It's going to take a really long time to do this. If they get it into humans this year, I think, within a year or two, when they start putting this in humans, I think you're going to see some really remarkable stories of people whose lives are just radically changed by the capabilities that this implant would give them.
Yeah, definitely. Neuralink is already talking about, potential of paralyzed people or people can't control their limbs, gaining access to controlling or walking, or using their hands. Like, it would be revolutionary for a lot of people, I think.
And you can see how the monkey demo, it directly feeds into that, right? Because this is basically exactly what you want, the ability you want to give a quadriplegic initially, so that they can get out of their box, interface to a computer, get access to the internet, talk to the people that they want to talk to. And then farther down the road, as the things get more sophisticated, you take the other half of the implant and you plug it into their muscles and whatnot, and you bridge whatever the damage is that they have, and you give them control of their body back via this sort of electronic shunt around whatever the damage is in their nervous system.
Yeah. Awesome, James. Thank you. And we'll talk to you in the next episode. All right. Thanks, James. All right. Bye.